So we just mentioned that only the grains that can become, Talmud says, only the grains that can become leaven have the potential to become matzah. And only the grains that can be made into matzah to do the mitzvah, the commandment of eating matzah at the Seder, only those can become leaven. So what about rice? So the answer, the Talmud says that rice is not one of those 5 grains that can become leaven, but there is an opinion, the Talmud says, Masnisin delok Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri. Our Mishnah is not like the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who says, Orez min daganhu, that orez, rice, is a kind of grain. That was a minority opinion in the Talmud. And he says that if it becomes leaven and you eat it on Passover, you're punished for that. It actually becomes leaven. As Rabbi Yochanan ben Tzuri said, that's a little bit confusing. He says it comes close to being leavened. So does it mean it's leaven or it's not leaven? So the Talmud says, what do you mean close to leaven? Do you mean that it becomes leaven too fast? Or do you mean that it doesn't really become leaven all the way? So the Talmud says, no, it means chametz gomer. So the Talmud says, in the end, the Talmud says that it's only according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that, that's an interesting question. Is it not really leaven, but it's similar? It seems that rice has a kind of borderline position. In fact, this is reflected in another way also. For instance, when you make a blessing on one of the 5 grains, let's say you eat something that's not bread, but it's made out of one of the 5 grains. You eat pretzels. They're made out of wheat, but they're not bread. What bracha do you make? Mizonot. Now, in theory, if you make, cake out of something else, out of corn, make cake out of corn, you make shahakol. You don't say mizonot on that. But rice, if you eat rice, you say mizonot. Even though the after blessing is not the same after blessing as if you ate one of the 5 grains. So rice has a sort of funny position. We do not hold that rice can become leaven, and therefore you can't make matzah out of rice, but it does have this sort of borderline position, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri's position in the Talmud was that it's actually a grain. Okay. Now there's another piece of Talmud later on in Pesachim. The Talmud says, "My shnei tavshilin." The Talmud says that you're supposed to eat 2 cooked dishes at the Seder, one in memory of and we have 2 things on the Seder plate to sort of fulfill this. One in memory of the Passover offering, and one in memory of the Chagiga, which was an offering that was given for every holiday. So the Gemara says, what 2 dishes should you have? So Rav Huna said he ate beets and rice. Rava, Habimahader Asilka Va'aruza. And Rava, who was a student, would also try and find beets and rice to eat them at the Seder. Why? Because that's what his teacher did. So that's what he wanted to do. So Rav Ashi says, oh, well, if he ate beets and rice at the Seder, we see that he must not have been worried about the position of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, because he's eating them not as matzah, but as leaven. I mean, not as leaven, but not as matzah, just as a dish of rice. Because Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said that rice can become chametz, and you can use it as matzah. And that is where the Gemara finishes off. So rice, only according to one opinion in the Talmud, can become leaven. But according to everybody else, and here you see an actual story about Rav Huna, that he ate rice at the Seder. He must have been a Sephardi, huh? Just kidding around. There were no Sephardim and Ashkenazim back in the time of the Talmud. But of course, now, today, colloquially, we understand, we have a sense that Sephardic Jews eat rice. Actually, when I was a rabbi in India 25 years ago, Indian Jews don't know much about Ashkenazic Jews. Over there, everybody's a Sephardi. And they, of course, eat rice at the Seder. That's what you eat at a Seder. And so I decided I would not eat rice because, I was an Ashkenazic Jew. And to survive, and India didn't have, kosher for Passover stores. It had nothing. So for me to survive on Pesach was not so easy. I got matzah, and the Jews there make matzah. I got some extra matzah through the embassy, but I have a lot of stories about trying to about Pesach in India. Anyway, but that's for another time. So how is it so that Ashkenazic Jews do not eat rice? Where did that come from? Where did that start? So the earliest mention of it, now this is Rashi, right? Rashi is pretty early. Rashi is the 11th century. And Rashi says, you're not allowed to make grain into something to eat on Pesach unless it's matzah. Kitniot, but any kind of legume, including rice, other things, mutter lavash, you're allowed to cook those on Passover. That's Rashi. Maimonides, right? He lives around a little bit slightly later, but not much later. He's obviously a Sephardic Jew. He says, Ein Isser, there is no prohibition of chametz, of eating leaven, except with the 5 grains, wheat, barley, oats, spelt, and rye. And Kitniot, but legumes, kigon ores v'dochen, like rice and millet, upolim and beans, va'adashim and lentils, v'chayotzeban, and anything else like that, they do not become chametz. You can make them into kemach, into flour. You can make rice into flour, and you can, mix it with water, and you can cook it, and you can let it rise, and it might look like it rises, but that's not called chametz. We're allowed to eat that. That's not called rising. That is called sirchon, some kind of fermentation, perhaps, but that's not halakhically called rising. Now, it's interesting. There's another halacha that I want to read you because it's going to come into play later, which is that the Talmud says, we don't do this, but the Talmud says that if you need any one of the 5 grains that could become leaven, but you need them without water, you only need them with fruit juice, that also does not rise. Very interesting. In theory, in Talmudic times, if you had mixed, flour, wheat flour with, orange juice, and or pomegranate juice, and you had made bread out of it, that would not be considered leaven. That would not be considered chametz. Another halacha that's important to know that he mentions here is that if you take the grains of wheat or barley or oats, spelt, or rye, and you boil them right away, you cook them at very high heat right away, in less than the amount of time it would take for them to become leaven, they also do not become leaven, because once grain is cooked, it cannot become leaven. So those are going to be important later on. Okay, so where do we have kitniot? When does this notion of not eating legumes come in, especially for Ashkenazi Jews? So the earliest mention of it is Rabbi Eliezer of Vermisa. Vermisa was worms, and this is early Ashkenaz. This is the book of the Rokeach, which is part of Hasidei Ashkenaz, the early pietists of Germany. They lived in basically early German Jewry in the 10th, 11th century. 12th century, lived in 3 cities: Speyer, Worms, and Magenza, Mainz. And that was the beginnings of Ashkenaz. So here he says, you have to make sure that your grain doesn't become wet. And you have to look through your salt. If you have salt, you have to look through it, make sure there's no chita, there's no grain, there's no pieces of wheat that have fallen in your salt. This thing that we don't eat beans and lentils, he says there's a custom in Vermisa, in Worms, in the 1200s, that we don't eat lentils. Why don't we eat lentils? Why don't people in Vermisa, in Worms, in the 1200s, not eat lentils? The answer is because if you've ever been to a country besides America where everything's prepackaged, if you go, when I lived in India, for instance, when I went into a store to buy rice, it's just big sacks. That's it. Nothing's prepackaged. And so when you buy rice, there's always other grains that are mixed in there. Not a lot, maybe a few, but there's always something mixed in. And so Sephardic Jews actually who do eat rice on Pesach, they check it very, very carefully. In fact, there's a law, some people check it 3 times. Because if you ever looked at a rice grain and a wheat grain, they're not that different. They can look a lot alike. So you could imagine that that might be an issue. So I also want to keep an eye on what's the problem with kitniot. What's the issue at stake, right? So the earliest issue seems to be what? It's not confusion at the level of flour. It's not that people don't know what you're allowed and not allowed to eat. It is that when you buy rice, inevitably there's wheat mixed into it. Why can't you check it? Well, you could check it, but we're worried. Why? Because Pesach, Jews traditionally have been more strict about Pesach, probably than regular kashrut. In fact, Ashkenazic Jews, for many things, will use glass on Pesach for milk and meat. They don't have to kashrut in between, but depends what. But for Passover, we actually are Ashkenazic Jews very strict about glass. Why? Either it absorbs or it doesn't absorb. The answer is there's different opinions about it. And for Pesach, it's called Chumra de Pesach. For Pesach, we are exceedingly careful. Why? Because number one, we're not used to chametz, right? It's permitted the rest of the year. It's only forbidden for 1 week. So like you have to pay special attention or you end up messing up. But the other part is that it's a worse punishment. It's much worse in terms of Jewish law to eat leaven on Passover than to eat, a ham sandwich. In fact, there's I know somebody who grew up Reform, and she said to me, when I was little, we would never eat bread on Passover. We ate ham and cheese on matzah. And, so on the one hand, that sounds like, that sounds crazy. But on the other hand, it's not so crazy from a halachic point of view, because it's worse to eat bread on Pesach than to eat ham and cheese. I'm not saying you could eat ham and cheese, but that's not entirely, there's one is better than the other. Okay, so now we'll move a little bit ahead in Ashkenazic history. This is the later 1200s. This is a book called the Sefer Mitzvot Katan. It's written in France in the 1200s by Rabbi Yitzchak of Korbel. And it's one of the early books that goes through all the commandments, all the mitzvot, and tries to enumerate them and talk about them. And he says, he's talking here about Passover. And he says, and regarding Kitniot, regarding legumes and things like that, Rabotenu Noagim, our rabbis are accustomed, right? The language here is very important. Noagim are accustomed, right? Because it doesn't say gezerah, decree. It doesn't say they made a law, because rabbis of the Talmud make new laws, make new decrees, right? They make a gezerah. But in the 1300s and in the 1200s in France, you don't make a gezerah. That's a Talmudic thing. But he says our rabbis had the custom, right? Custom in Judaism emerges sui generis all the time. I mean, a lot of what we do is custom, and it emerges for lots of reasons. Actually, it's another India story. When I lived in India on Pesach, the Indian Jews told me they didn't have really a written tradition; they had more an oral tradition. So I could see custom develop. They said to me, Rabbi, you can only eat green masala on Passover. You cannot eat brown masala on Passover. And I said, well, why is that? And they said, because it's Passover, Rabbi. Don't you know it's going to be Passover? So I said, yeah, no, it's going to be Passover. And they said, well, that's why you can't eat brown masala. But they had no idea why you couldn't eat brown masala. They just thought Jews always eat only green masala on Passover. Now, I realized what it was very quickly, which is that brown masala is dried spices. Green masala is fresh spices. And so the odds of brown spices having some wheat mixed in, wheat grains mixed into it in India are very high. Whereas fresh spices that are, green because they're, cilantro and jalapenos. So that's fine. But that's not how they thought about it. They thought about it as that's the custom. That's what Jews do. If you had said to them, does Jew in America only eat green masala on Pesach? They say, of course. That's how they saw the world. So that's what we're saying here. Rabotenu Noagim, our rabbis have the custom to forbid on Passover kitniot, to forbid lentils, rice, legumes. Now, then he says, right now, you could imagine this is a moment when the custom is just kind of emerging. It says Noagim B'hem Heter says there are great people that permit it. It says Mori and my master Rabbeinu Yechiel of Paris, Hayanoeg Lechol B'Pesach Pol Halavan. Says my teacher, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, he ate on Pesach, he ate white beans. And he said that his rabbis did that. And his proof is that in the Talmud, Rabbi Yochanan ate rice on Pesach. We see that in the Talmud. So he says, even though my teacher ate beans, and even though the Talmud says he could eat rice, he says it's really very difficult for us to permit something that everybody here it has the custom of saying it's not allowed to be eaten. And they say that the custom goes back to Chachamim HaKadmonim, to the early Chachamim. Now that's very interesting, right? Because we don't have evidence that it goes back to very early sources. Now, maybe he means the Smak, which was 50 years before. But I'm not surprised by this because, again, I learned this from the Jews of India, that once you have a custom, there's a sense that custom always was there. Probably we have customs that if you ask the average Orthodox Jew, how long have Jews done X, Y, and Z? They'd say, oh, everybody always did that. Moses, Kabbalat Shabbat, how far back does Kabbalat Shabbat go, right? So, the average Jew might say, oh, Kabbalat Shabbat, such an important prayer, it must come from Moses. But of course, it only goes back 500 years to the rabbis of Tzad. Before that, nobody sang Kabbalat Shabbat. So sometimes when we have a strong custom, and that's what we do, there's a sense of playing it backwards. So that could be part of what's going on here. And he says, why did they do that? So he says, it can't be that they thought legumes really become chametz. That's impossible, because every child knows that legumes do not become chametz. I have a little English here. By the way, let me post a link to this in the chat, because that way, if you want to look at it. Anybody wants access to the document? There it is, because sometimes the Hebrew will be a different place on the page than the English. I don't have a lot of English here, I apologize. Okay. So he says, it can't be that they really thought it becomes leaven. It definitely doesn't become leaven. No, everybody knows that. Only 5 grains can become leaven. And he says, that's why we should keep this custom. He says, this is not a custom that is based on a mistaken notion. Right? If this were, there is such a thing called a minhag tot, a custom that is a mistake. And you don't have to keep a custom like that. It could change. But he says, this is not that kind of custom, because it's impossible that they thought, if this had become a custom because, regular people thought that rice becomes chametz, I think what he's saying is we would get rid of that custom. We would change that, because it's just ignorance. It's not a custom. He says, but over here, there was a practical implication. There was a reason why this became a custom. And therefore, it makes sense to keep it. Then he calls it a decree. He does call it a gezerah decree. It's sort of hard to call it that, because we wouldn't really say it's a gezerah decree. That's a Talmudic thing. Who the cave into Kitniot, who he says, since legumes are something that are cooked in a pot, and they look like grain cooking, if a dagan, and grain is also something that's cooked in a pot or made into bread. So if you permit kitniot, if you permit legumes, if you're going to permit making cornbread, how hard is it to go from cornbread to wheat bread, right? In other words, somebody's going to grow up eating cornbread, and they can be like, well, I don't know, bread is bread, so this is a little bit different, by the way, than the reason of the smak, right? The smak 50 years earlier says the reason is not that we're worried that you make bread out of corn, you make bread out of rice, you make bread out of wheat. We know you're not going to. We're worried that it's all mixed in together and you won't check it well. But here, this is a different reason, right? Here, the reason is we're worried that people are going to, it's more of an oral tradition. Maybe people don't know the law so well. And they'll just, they'll be like, okay, we used to eat rice bread. They'll end up eating regular bread, because they're made in similar ways. He says that they're cooked in pots, they're made into bread. It'll be very easy to get them mixed up. Even though the Talmud says you're allowed to eat rice, that was only at their time, that they were experts in halacha. But now, here in the 13th century, people just don't know Jewish law that well. You can't rely on, you have to, in other words, there's an upside and downside of oral tradition. Judaism is supposed to be an oral tradition. Now we have everything written down in books. So if everybody's an expert, then you can, it's easy to be more lenient, because people can distinguish. But people don't know very much. Sometimes you have to be more strict. I find this with the art scroll books. If you ever look in the art scroll books of Jewish law, on the top of the page in the English language, they're usually more strict than they are in the Hebrew notes. Usually there's Hebrew notes on the bottom. There's English language and Hebrew notes. And in Hebrew notes, inevitably, they are always more strict than what's in the English on top. And I think the reason is that, when you're talking to the people, and the people are not experts, you need to have certain boundaries, keep people in. It's very easy to make a mistake. But if people are experts, then that's a different story. Okay, this is the Mordechai, slightly later, 1240, really around the same time. And the Mordechai lived in Ashkenaz in Eastern Europe. And he was killed, actually, for being a Jew. Wow. In Nuremberg in Germany in 1298 with his wife and his daughter. I'm sorry, he was married to the daughter of Rabbi Yechiel Paris, who was mentioned before, right? Who ate the beans but did not eat kitniot. Who ate beans but then maybe did not eat other kinds of kitniot. So the Mordechai writes, rice and millet and beans and such things, they don't become chametz. Even if you need, rice flour and you try and make it into bread, that's not called chametz. And therefore, we should permit that which is sold. There's some kind of food sold that's made out of rice, and we're not worried about the Talmud's opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri that rice could become. And then he quotes the Smak. He says, "Amnam Gisi harav Yitzchak mi Korbel." He says, "My father-in-law, the Rabbi Yitzchak of Korbel, wrote the Smak. He writes that nirali l'kaima minhag. He says we should keep the custom of not eating lentils on Pesach. The lesser called kitnios bezel. We should forbid all kitnios on Pesach. V'lo mitam chimetz, but not because it's going to become chametz. We know it's not. That would be a total mistake to think that. But because we've made a kind of decree, came into kitnios ma'asik there, because kitnios are made in a similar way to bread, they're made into flour. So we're worried about them getting mixed up. This is a little bit different. He says here, not that you'll make a mistake, but that you'll think what's rice flour. You'll think what's grain flour is actually rice flour. Okay. And then he says, "Minhag hagon hu lizar mikol kitnios." Says it's a good custom to be careful of all legumes on Pesach. Mikol davar shekorim legume, the French word, it turns out, for legumes, legume. And he says also mustard we shouldn't. Even though the Talmud permits these things, the Talmud even permits rice. That was only in their time when they were experts. Okay. The Torah. So now we come down to the codes of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch, right? The precursor to the Shulchan Aruch is the Torah. And he writes, "V'yesh osem lachol orez b'chol mini kitnios b'tasha." There are those who forbid eating rice and other kinds of legumes. Why? And he gives the early reason, which is that maybe little grains of wheat or barley got mixed in. He says this is a excessive stringency, and this is not our practice, right? So custom has everything to do with it. It's very strong in Judaism. We've been trying to say custom is stronger than law, but it's interesting here. He's not worried about mixing up, thinking that you're allowed to make bread out of grain because you used to make bread out because your parents made bread out of rice. He's worried that for the original reason of the smak, that maybe some grains got mixed in there. The Beit Yosef, this is the author of our Shulchan Aruch. He first wrote a commentary on the Torah, the early version of the Code of Jewish Law. And he quotes Rabbi Yechiel of Paris and other great rabbis. Says, Yesh Osim, there are those who forbid eating rice and other kinds of legumes. And he says, I don't know why they want to be so strict about it. He quotes the Smak that we quoted, the Sefer Mitzvos Katan, who says that there are those that have the custom not to eat them. And there are Rabbi Yechiel of Paris and other great people did eat beans. The Kashma Oda Davar Lahater, and the Smak says it's very hard to make it permitted. And he quotes from him just, that we know it doesn't become chametz, but it's because it's going to get mixed up. And maybe it'll be hard to separate one out from the other. And then he says, he says we should be more strict. Okay, and that is in the Shulchan Aruch. Although we'll see that the Shulchan Aruch, this is the Maharil. Maharil writes, he shouldn't say that just because it's permitted biblically, legumes, that it's permitted. Because anything that the rabbis have decreed is a big deal. Now, is this really a decree? It seems hard to call this a decree. The Shulchan Aruch, Rabbi Yosef Kar. Now, the Shulchan Aruch and the Beit Yosef, which we just read, the Beit Yosef seem to be strict, but when he writes the Shulchan Aruch, he says the following: Elu Dvarim, right, this is Rabbi Yosef Kar writing the 1500s. For late 1400s. You can fulfill your mitzvah of matzah with the 5 grains, but not with rice or any other kinds of legumes, and they also don't become chametz. Now that is where he ends. He says, that we eat legumes. The Rama, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who lived not long after but was an Ashkenazic Jew, he says there are those who forbid it. And it says, "V'aminig b'Ashkenaz lahachmir." It says the custom in Ashkenaz in Eastern Europe is to be strict. Ve'en lashanas, and we shouldn't do any different. You got to do what your custom is. Miupashat de'en osrim b'diavad. He says, but right, this is 500 years ago. He says, let's say that it got mixed up. Let's say that you're cooking something for Pesach, and by accident you put in some, beans. So naflu tocha tamshil, if it fell into the dish, then you would permit it. He says, after the fact, you would permit it. And you're allowed to get benefit from it. You can't get benefit from chametz, from actual leaven, but you can get benefit from legumes. Let's say you made sunflower oil and you want to light it as a candle on Pesach, you could. We don't forbid them if they fall into the dish. And you don't have to sell them, you're allowed to hold on to them. And then he says there are certain things that are not kitnios at all. For instance, anise, and alendar. I'm not sure exactly what that is. And that's how it seems to me. Maybe the English has. Okay. We go a little bit later. Now, this is Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Shelos Yavitz. Now, Rabbi Yaakov Emden was an Eastern European rabbi, very well known to historians and rabbis, 16 to 1700s. And he is known for being a bit of a radical. That's how he was in many areas. He was a traditionalist, but also radical in some ways. And he writes, this is very interesting, and this is really an interesting historical lens. He says, Timhane al kol gaonei hador. He says, I am shocked by all of the great rabbis of my generation. Asher hoyu lefaneinu, and the ones that came before. Shalo samuel libam ledavar azel lebatal minhag mamish. He says, why didn't they get rid of this custom of not eating kitniot, of not eating legumes on Pesach? Because this has become a custom. It's not a gezerah, it's not a decree, it's a custom, he says. And it's a custom that we have a concept that you can't have a decree or a custom that most of the Jews are not able to keep. And he, in his time, says that, that this is something most Jews can't keep. And they've even made it worse. They've added on to the categories of legumes. There are things that are forbidden because they're grain. There are things that are forbidden because of legumes. And then there are things that are forbidden because they're like legumes. He says, for instance, mustard. V'chimon, shenikra kimel, v'gam anas. He says all these things, they were permitted. And we just saw that they were permitted in the Shulchan Aruch, even the Ramah. And by the 1700s, 150 years later, they start to forbid other things. Right? That's how custom works. It gets bigger. And even oils of kitnios they want to forbid. V'dakirna karavina talia v'hava abezdin rosh mesifta po agon Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch sheichmer ma'oda fila b'pola mitzvah. And he says, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch, the great rabbi in my place, he even wants to forbid these certain kinds of green beans, it is, that are dried with salt, even while they're still wet. And then he says, the Yoti b'Mannheim, when I was in Mannheim, Ratzu lesor hapri ha'aretz shekorin erd afel, kartafolin, tapuchei adama. He says, when I was in Mannheim, the rabbis there wanted to forbid potatoes. Right now, why would you forbid potatoes? Right, for us, like potatoes is, if you're really religious, that's what you eat on Pesach: potato flour. Everything's made out of potato flour. Used to be, but it's become a big problem, by the way, for kiddush, because in shuls, if you want to make kiddush, you have to eat like a meal with the kiddush. So you have to eat something that's mizonot. But if you have cake, most of the Pesach cake now is made out of potato flour, because there are people who don't eat gebraks. There are people who are very strict and they don't eat a matzah meal that's made. There's a worry maybe it didn't get fully cooked or something. It's mixed with water, baked into something. So it's very hard. So you can't find anything that's mizonot anymore that's cake on for Pesach. But he says that in Manheim they wanted to forbid potatoes. Now, why would you forbid potatoes? Why does that fit? What does that fit into, right? You would never worry that there's a potato, that if you buy potatoes, there's grain mixed into it, right? You're not worried that there's a wheat grain among your potatoes and you're going to miss it, right? So what's the issue with potatoes? What are you worried about? So the answer, of course, is that potatoes are made into flour, potato flour, right? And the proof is that we can make potato flour cake. We could probably make potato flour bread for Pesach, and that would be permitted. But they're obviously, in other words, because part of the reason was that people get mixed up. So, right, how far do you go? You could go all the way to potatoes. Because they made a flour out of them. And the Rav and the Yavit says, I stood up against them. And I said to them, the community cannot bear if you will make potatoes forbidden on Pesach. That's what the poor people eat. People who are starving, he says, they have potatoes. That's it. If you'll forbid potatoes on Pesach, people have nothing to eat. And I was able to successfully battle the rabbis down from making potatoes forbidden. And the rabbis finally agreed with me that we shouldn't forbid something new. That which hadn't been forbidden before. There was no rabbi there right then. He says, wouldn't it be great if all the rabbis of the generation agreed with me to get rid of this problem, get rid of Kitniot being forbidden? Okay, so he's saying a few things, right? He's saying, number one, where do you draw the line, right? If the problem is getting mixed up between one grain and another, one kind of flour and another, where do you draw the line? You're not forbidding potatoes. And he says, and so where does he draw the line? He draws the line at what's called davar chadash, that whatever was originally part of the custom was originally part of the custom. But something new that was not part of the custom of being forbidden, you can't lump that into the custom. That's not part of the custom. Now, on the one hand, we're talking about a custom. So whatever becomes the custom is the custom. Where do you draw the line? Why don't we know that originally there were people who did not eat rice, but they did eat beans, like Rabbi Yitzchak of Paris. So maybe we should draw the line there. So it's an interesting question, where you draw the line. This is going to become a question in modern times, modern meaning after the 1500s, when the New World was discovered, right? Because what comes from the New World? The answer is corn. Corn comes from the New World, and also peanuts come from the New World. Those didn't exist in Europe. So the question is going to be later on, and Rav Moshe Feinstein will very famously address this, what can we lump into Kitniot? What can we lump into being part of this Gezerah, right? It's impossible that peanuts were part of the original custom because they didn't exist in Europe in the 1300s, in the 1200s. But yet, actually, and in fact, when I was a child, the only oil you could get that was kosher for Pesach, stamped for Pesach, was peanut oil. But that was one of them. I remember in my kitchen seeing OUP on peanut oil. You won't find that today. You will not find it. Even though Rabbi Moshe Feinstein says you could have it. Now, obviously, we do have a lot more things available to us, but that's going to be part of the question. What's the nature of custom, right? Maybe you should just let custom, do you let custom just go and become whatever it wants to become? Do you stop it somewhere? We're not talking about a decree, even though it's called Gezerah, sometimes I'm not really talking about that, we're talking about custom. And it can start to take its toll, right? Now, had potatoes been forbidden, which was suggested, could you imagine what our Pesach would be like? Of course, now we have quinoa. I have a congregant in St. Louis who wrote a cookbook called Quinoa, the Pesach Wonder Food, right? But I have to tell you, Google it and you'll see that 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when quinoa first started to become popular for Pesach, it was a big argument, is quinoa going to be permitted on Pesach or not? Maybe it should be part of this original, maybe it should be, it'd be easy to, quinoa maybe looks a little bit like, I don't know, barley, so maybe we should, You could grind quinoa into flour, even make almonds into flour now. This is the Orach HaShulchan. Orach HaShulchan's later, Rabbi Epstein. And he says that he tends to sometimes make a lot of decisions slightly based on what's going on among the Jewish people. And he says this, that our rabbis, that we have received from our ancestors, that Kitniot is forbidden. Mishum geder midin Torah, asar lanu levata. He says it's become a geder, a fence around the Torah, and we can't get rid of it. And those who are lenient about it, they show that they have no fear of heaven and no fear of sin, and that they don't understand the Torah. So right, custom is important. It's very important. This is the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah lived in the late 1800s, early 1900s. The Chafetz Chaim, Rabbi Yisrael Meir Kagan, and he died in 1930. The Mishnah Berurah was there in the late 1800s. It says, it says there are those who forbid Kitniot, but it's not forbidden from the Torah. It's a chumrah. It's a stricture, because sometimes they get mixed up, and you can't figure out what's what kind of grain. And also they're ground into grain. It says all of those things. Vein l'shana, it shouldn't change it. We call makam b'shas adchak. Let's say that you have a problem. Let's say you can't get anything else except legumes. Or let's say it's a time of famine. This happened in Jewish history. Or you're a soldier in war and all they got to eat is legumes. Are you allowed to eat those on Pesach? So he says, shas adchak. It's a very pressing time. She'ein la'adam malechel. You don't have what to eat. You can cook legumes, obviously not the 5 grains, but anything else. He says, even in this situation, you should yaktim kitniot la'ores. He says rice is not the first thing you should eat, because rice was more a part of the custom, because it was a lot like rice and millet were more like grains. So first start with beans and different kinds of legumes and what do they call it? Lentils. Okay. By the way, you could imagine, we don't run into times of famine so much in America, but let's say if somebody's sick, if somebody is ill, even if they're not deathly ill, mutter, you can cook for them lentils. By the way, you know who this comes up for all the time? Babies. Babies are considered chole, they're considered ill. They have that status in Jewish law. So every Pesach, of course, I get questions of, Rabbi, can I feed my child? My child is just, the beginning of eating, and he eats or she eats whatever it is, cornmeal cereal, something like that they have for babies, or rice cereal, very common thing, Gerber rice cereal, whatever it is. So some of it, so I say yes, of course, because we don't have, babies are allowed to eat kitniot, even though you might not. In theory, maybe even a baby could have chametz, but if it had to, but if a person is ill and they need, be an interesting question. Let's say that a person cannot, let's say a person is, you run into this sometimes. Let's say a person is diabetic. They can't eat matzah, and they can't eat, and they can't, if you don't have matzah, you don't have kitniot, and let's say they can't eat, let's say if somebody can't eat meat. So you could have certain situations in which they have very little to eat. And sometimes, so we'd have to figure out what's called a chola, what's called ill. But by the way, it's also an interesting question, does custom reverse itself, right? In other words, the custom that emerged was because of confusion in different places. So let's say in Israel today, right? In Israel today, there are a lot of Sephardic Jews. Sephardic Jews eat legumes. They eat things made out of rice. And in America, if you go to buy kosher Passover things, something says kosher Passover, it almost is definitely kosher Passover for Ashkenazic Jews, meaning it has no kitniot in it. But that's not the case in Israel. In Israel, if you go into the grocery store, half the things in the grocery store, if not more, are actually have kitniot in them. But they say kosher for Passover because a lot of Sephardic Jews there. So at what point, does the custom change? What if some Ashkenazic Jews just start buying it, and all their friends are eating it? And we'll see later on, Rabbi Abad Yosef says, if you're invited over to a Sephardic house, you can eat there. You're not allowed to eat the legumes, you can't eat the kitniot, but you could eat something cooked in a pot that had kitniot, cooked in it. could these kinds of customs, I'm not talking about a gzeira from the Talmud, a decree from the Talmud, but a custom emerged over time. Could it change? That's becoming a very big question in Israel today. So Rav Moshe, this is Rav Moshe Feinstein's tshuva, and he writes about whether he writes about peanuts. And here's what he says. By the way, you'll have a very hard time finding peanuts that are kosher Pesach. Although I guess if you found raw ones with a shell, I assume that'll be okay. He says that the nature of this kind of custom is that you can't include new things. As the Ivit said, you can't include new things in this custom. Whatever was part of it was part of it. You can't just make up and say everything's forbidden now. It was forbidden for a certain reason. Certain things got confused. And we know why. Since this was never a decree that rabbis got together and said, it's an interesting distinction. This is not that rabbis got together and said, we need to forbid Kitniot. It just emerged over time. It's custom, which is important. That became the custom not to eat them because we're so careful about Pesach. So therefore, he says only those things that were forbidden as part of that custom are forbidden as part of that custom, but nothing else can become, something new can't become part of that custom. And therefore, he says, for instance, potatoes, which did not exist then, I guess potatoes are also from the New World, they cannot become, even though they fit into the category of being made into flour, so you might think you'd include them, there was an attempt to, you don't include them because it wasn't part of the original custom. And then he writes, what about, and he says rabbis did not want to add other things to this category of legumes, of kitniot. And then he says, so he says, even if they're planted in places where there are peanut. He says, what about peanuts? They were not forbidden in many places. If there's no special custom to forbid peanuts, you can't forbid it. You shouldn't be so strict about these things. If somebody has a custom not to eat peanuts, okay, then the peanuts are forbidden to them. But if you're in doubt about peanuts, then you don't forbid it because it was not part of the original custom. He says, therefore, we should put a hechsher, we should put a Passover seal on peanuts. We should inspect the factory, make sure that there's no grain mixed into the peanuts, make sure they're not produced with anything that's made out of the 5 grains or other kinds of legumes. And we should, you should have packages of peanuts that are kosher for Pesach. You won't find them in America. Peanut oil. And there is a hechsher, he says, on peanut oil. This is probably written, 40 years ago. And he says that's a good thing. Of course, you won't find that either today. This is Rabbi Tzvi Schechter. He's a rabbi at Yeshiva University, and he wrote a book about some of the customs of Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who was his teacher. He says, he says there's always a question of, at a time of famine or a time of difficulty, can you permit peanuts? And he says sometimes you can. And he says Rav Chaim, that was Rabbi Soloveitchik's grandfather, said that in a time like that you could permit it. If you're going to be strict about something that's only a custom, as if it's something from the Torah, that sounds a little like Bal Tosef. It's a little bit like adding on to the Torah. You're not supposed to add on to the Torah, make new forbidden things, even though, of course, the whole thing is, it's a custom that emerged. A custom is very important. But, okay, so I want to finish with one thing. I have a small class every morning for about 20 minutes, and we've been for about a year studying the responsa of Orthodox rabbis toward the Reform movement, different aspects of the Reform movement. And there's a whole range of rabbis who were kind of in the middle between Reform and Orthodox. We were talking about the 1820s, 1819, 1820. It's very early. And even the Reform rabbis are really kind of Orthodox. And when they argue about Jewish law, they really argue about Jewish law. And this is a tshuva response from Rabbi Moshe Kunitz. He was born in 1774 in Hungary. He was a student of a very famous of a rabbi named Rabbi Moshe Mintz. And who was the chief rabbi of Ofen? Okay. Rabbi, and he was later a dayan in Pest. So there's an interesting question about, is this rabbi kind of a reformer or not? So Mark Shapiro, who's a professor at the University of Scranton, he has an article about a different book that Rabbi Moshe Kunitz wrote, and he argues that Rabbi Moshe Kunitz was not a reformer. That you see that from his writing, you can see he was not a reformer, but there are others who try and argue the point. Now, what it means to be a reformer is a different thing in 1820 than it is, today. We're talking about the first Hamburg temple had a mechitza, had a division between men and women. The big questions were, could you have an organ on a weekday or on Shabbat played by a non-Jew, and could you have prayer in German instead of in Hebrew? Those were sort of the big questions. And Rabbi Kunitz quotes a Rambam that I want to read. He says, Maimonides writes that a court can suspend the application of a degree. A Beit Din can, if you have a custom, a Beit Din can suspend it, even though that Beit Din, that court, is not as great as the earlier court. There are times when because a sociological issue comes up, that sometimes you have to undo or change a rabbinic decree. What's the case? Let's say a court wants to make a new law, a new rule, because the things are slipping beyond certain boundaries. Let's say that a Jewish court feels that in our day, we need a new fence that didn't exist before. So they're allowed to give punishments, even though that's not what the Talmud said. But you can't do it for generations. You can only do it for that time. Now, you can't say that's the law. You say that's for right now. And if you need, in a very short term, to, let's say, tell people they don't have to do a certain mitzvah, or to violate a certain mitzvah in order to preserve Judaism, you can do that just for that moment. Just like sometimes you have to amputate a limb in order to keep the whole body alive. So to a court, sometimes we'll have to tell people to violate a mitzvah in order to keep everything else going. As it says, the rabbis say about saving a life, that when it comes to saving a life, you violate one Shabbat in order to have many Shabbats. Now, what the practical implication of this, obviously, is a very dangerous arena. But the question that Rabbi Kunitz is addressing is, if you have a time when things are very difficult, could you permit Kitniot? Could you permit Legumes? Like, let's say there are soldiers fighting a war, or let's say that there's some kind of famine. Now, we know, the Mishnah Berurah said, quoting earlier sources, that you certainly can. But of course, the question is, to what extent, right? So I'll take a look at this. This is his tshuva. It's a very difficult tshuva to sort of figure out, but it's from a book called Hamitz Tarif. This was published in 1820. And this is a picture of Rabbi Kunitz, the rabbi of Oban. And here he writes, I was asked about the legal decision of the great rabbi, his teacher, the Maharam Mintz, the Rabbi Moshe Mintz, who said that he permitted, at a time of famine, to eat Kitniot on Pesach, to eat legumes on Pesach. L'chayalot Yisrael, especially for soldiers that had to go into the army, because they wouldn't have what to eat if they didn't eat Kitniot, if they didn't eat legumes. So some people argued against this, that you have to be greater than the earlier court in order to change things. So he says, first of all, now, so it's interesting, right? You would think it's a no-brainer to permit this, but it wasn't. Now, partly that is because I think the Reform wanted to permit Kitniot. I think that's part of the issue here. In other words, I think had there been no nascent Reform movement, probably would have been easier just to permit it. Because we know that in a time of dechak, a time of difficulty, we do permit legumes for Ashkenazi Jews. It's always permitted for Sephardic Jews, of course. But here, I think because it was the beginning of the Reform movement, there's more hesitancy. And so Rabbi Moshe Mintz permitted it for these soldiers, but there was some kind of backlash. So he says, first of all, Rabbi Moshe Mintz was so great that he could argue with rabbis from much, much earlier time. That's what he says first. And then he says, he quotes a few different sources, and he quotes the Rambam that we just read, that for a small time, you're allowed to. And then he says, Va'anochi hayadua et tzidkato, I know his righteousness, and bati achrav amileti et davarav, and I want to expand his words, or I want to, it's a little hard to know what he means here. Le'amar ki nachon lahamadaktikim, I want to say that it's even permitted for those who are very careful. Lachlitenu et kitniot beroschen. He says, here's what you could do. Take the kitniot, take the legumes, and boil them quickly. Cook them quickly. Or cook them in fruit juice or in wine vinegar. And he says it's not going to ruin the kitniot. It's not going to ruin the legumes. But what he's doing is he's putting together two things, right? The Talmud, if you remember back, Maimonides had quoted this, says that if you took real grain, one of the 5 grains, and you cooked it in fruit juice, it does not become leaven. So he says, if you're worried about permitting kitniot in a time when things are very difficult, so just combine the two things. Take the kitniot and cook them, make rice bread, but not using water. Do it using fruit juice, because then you have, two things that are kind of nipping chametz in the bud, right? You have, first of all, it's kitniot, which has not become chametz, and second of all, even if it was chametz, it might be permitted to cook it in fruit juice. Now, it's a little bit hard to know. Is he saying this for the soldiers, or is he saying this more generally? It's very hard to sort of figure out. There are those that claim, there's not a lot written on this tshuva. I found one person that did write something on this tshuva and claims that he's trying to permit kitniot basically in this way, having these sort of two elements. And so but it's not a very clear tshuva. I will say that. And I won't go through the whole thing right now, but you're welcome to read it, or we can read it another time. But I read it over, 5 times, and it's very hard to figure out. Does he mean Hamadakti means the people who are very careful and people who care about this? Is this only at a time of famine, or is he saying this much more generally? It's very hard to know. But the fact that there's a lot of argument over who he was, clearly there are some people who took this tshuva to mean that he's saying, let's permit kitniot, let's permit legumes. And obviously 1820, it's not like us. I mean, a lot of these elements, a lot of the situation has changed, right? In other words, I don't think anybody could argue today that we don't have enough to eat on Pesach. It's like we have more food than anybody's ever had. We eat better than kings ate, 500 years ago. I mean, we all eat like a king would have eaten many years ago. No problem. And so it's very, some of this doesn't really, it's not that hard for us to not have kitniot. Although I think in Israel it's a little bit harder. For some people, certain kinds of diets, other things, it would make life easier. And so, of course, there are certain situations, of course, certain kinds of illness, certain kinds of difficult situations. Now, again, we're talking about Ashkenazi Jews, right? A person who, let's say, an Ashkenazi woman marries a Sephardic man, the mainstream halacha is that she doesn't have to keep kitniot. She can eat rice and beans on Pesach. So it's going to be interesting to see. If you Google around, you'll see that in the present moment, it's a very hot issue in Israel. In America, it's really not. In America, it's very different. In America, Ashkenazim really do not eat legumes. But if you look around, look in the Israeli scene, and you'll see that this is like a real struggle right now. Because in Israel, Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews are really, kind of all together. And the idea of eating kitniot is just more normalized. And the question is, could you argue that what was holding us back, the worries about confusion, maybe is not an issue anymore? And could it change? How does custom change? The reality is that Orthodoxy is a very democratic institution. I know it sounds funny, but it's not a movement, so it doesn't have a central office. There's no central, for instance, the conservative movement, 5 years ago, there's a central office, and they said you can eat kitniot, you can eat legumes on Pesach. That was it. So, but in Orthodoxy, we don't have that, right? Halacha changes, more strict, more lenient. It actually changes from the grassroots. I mean, sometimes people ask a rabbi in a community, but the general trend of halacha, and it does change over time in certain ways, but it happens in a very sort of democratic kind of grassroots way. It's just the nature of not being a sort of organized movement. So we'll see what will happen in Israel as time goes on. Okay. Any questions before we end?
Rabbi, what was the rabbi's name that was arguing that people need potatoes?
That was Rabbi Yaakov Emden. Yeah, Google him. He's very interesting.
What? Can you spell it? Sorry.
Emden. Rabbi Jacob Emden. Rabbi Yaakov Emden.
Okay.
Yeah. He's actually known for a very famous, he got into a bunch of arguments, but he also accused a certain famous rabbi of being a follower of Shabtai Tzvi in the 1700s, Rabbi Yonatan Eibschitz, and there was a kind of a war of books between them. And there's a lot of interesting stuff. Yeah. All right. Oh, I wish everybody a yeah.
Wait, quick question. What happened with peanuts?
I don't know. Go to Shalom's or Mati's and see if you can buy kosher for Pesach peanuts. You can't. What happened with peanuts? So there are people who eat peanuts, I assume. The general custom in American Orthodoxy, I think, is not to eat peanuts. Used to be to eat peanut oil. I have not seen peanut oil around. Now, there's one of the dilemmas is that if you can't get peanut oil for Pesach, well, you don't know what's in the oil. And I guess if you got raw peanuts, that were not processed, and you held like Rav Moshe, then there argued against Rav Moshe and said, no, it's things could become included in the custom, even if they weren't originally part of the custom, because the nature of custom is where do you draw the line? And I mean, it's interesting, by the way, I think the custom in America among Ashkenaz Jews is not to eat peanuts right now. Is that going to change? Did it used to? I think it probably used to be different, but and the custom is now not to use peanut. It's very interesting, by the way. Why don't we use peanut oil on Pesach? Why did we 40 years ago and we don't now? The answer is because the OU, the OK, they don't put hashkafa on it because they want to be more strict. So what's the custom? In other words, it's gotten to a certain point where actually the national kashrus organizations could determine what the custom is, right? What's the custom with regard to peanut oil? The answer is nobody uses peanut oil. But it's not because we don't think you use peanut oil. It's because the national kashrus organizations won't supervise peanut oil. So in a way, it's a chicken and egg issue. They're kind of determined. They shouldn't be determining the custom, but they kind of end up there. So one person could end up with the power, right? Whoever's the posek, whoever making decisions for the star K, the OU, the OK. But maybe that's not how it should be. But we can live without peanut oil for a week also. Yeah. Oh yeah. I can't hear you. I'm mute. Ellie, are you talking? If you're talking, you're on mute. Still can't hear you. You gotta unmute yourself. The lower left corner of your screen. Okay. Tell me later. All right. Chag Sameach, everybody. Have a good Pesach.